As the Republican challenger for the presidency in the election of 1968, Richard Nixon promised to quell the protests, restore law and order, and end the Vietnam War. His message spoke to conservative Americans who felt that the United States was out of control. Nixon called this group the silent majority. With their help, Nixon defeated Johnson's Vice President Hubert Humphrey. Nixon inherited a country in turmoil. In addition to the Vietnam War protests, there was continuing trouble in the nation's inner cities. For Nixon, the root of the nation's problems was not poverty or injustice, but what he called a whole era of permissiveness. He began his assault on that era by chipping away at some of the remaining Great Society social programs that he thought provided a disincentive to work. On the economic front, President Nixon's biggest problem was inflation, a steady increase in the price of goods, which reduced the purchasing power of many Americans, specifically those living on fixed incomes, like the poor and the retired. Traditionally, the government's way to fight inflation was to cut government spending, hoping that would cause prices to go down. President Nixon tried that, but it didn't work. Next, Nixon declared a freeze on prices, wages, and rents for 90 days, followed by a period of voluntary wage and price controls. These measures slowed the rise of inflation, but only temporarily. At the time of the 1972 presidential election, Nixon's economic measures seemed to be working. He was also drawing high marks for several foreign policy successes. Nixon's unprecedented trip to China helped open lines of communication that had been closed since the communist takeover of that country in 1949. American involvement in the Vietnam War had been drastically reduced, and American soldiers were coming home. And a dramatic overture to the Soviet Union had resulted in a historic arms control agreement. The American public rewarded President Nixon with a landslide victory, and Nixon used his public approval to try and halt the trend toward increased spending on social programs that had begun under previous administrations. He passed legislation that returned billions of dollars and the power to spend it to the states, in turn diminishing the power of Congress. Generally, Nixon sought to strengthen the power of the president over the Congress, setting off a struggle between those two branches of government. In 1973, inflation was again on the rise. A series of budget deficits resulted from government spending on the Vietnam War. An Arab embargo of oil shipments to the U.S. quadrupled oil prices. The price of gasoline soared, and no gas signs were common. The voluntary wage and price controls instituted by Nixon to combat the problem were not working. So he set rigid limits on how much the federal government spent and refused to spend money for programs already appropriated by the Democrat-controlled Congress. Later on in his term, the American public found out that the White House's struggles with Congress were part of a larger pattern of contempt for other branches of government. On June 17, 1972, 5 months before Nixon's landslide election, a team of 5 men linked to President Nixon's re-election committee were arrested while attempting to burglarize and install listening devices at the Democratic National Committee headquarters in the Watergate Hotel in Washington, D.C. The burglars had been hired by President Nixon's re-election committee, and their arrest touched off one of the worst political scandals in American history. Concerned by what the arrest might mean for their re-election chances, top White House aides, with President Nixon's approval, tried to cover up White House involvement by preventing the FBI and other police agencies from investigating the break-in on grounds of national security. What followed was a battle between Congress and the President that challenged the power of the presidency as well as the roles of the Congress and the courts.
The Watergate crisis became a national detective story. The entire country focused on television as revelation after revelation emerged, creating a more and more conclusive case that Nixon had been involved in the cover-up. An entire nation focused on trying to discover whether, in Nixon's own words, your president is a crook.
Finally, facing almost certain impeachment and removal from office, Nixon resigned the presidency on August 9, 1974.
I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow.
The Watergate scandal ultimately led to the conviction and sentencing of 20 men, including President Nixon's top aides. Yet its most damaging effect was how it undermined public respect and trust for the office of the president. When President Nixon resigned in 1974, Gerald Ford, a former Republican congressman from Michigan, became president. Ford was selected by Nixon in late 1973 to replace Vice President Spiro Agnew, who resigned rather than face bribery charges. Ford entered the White House at a time when public confidence in the government was low. He resolved to restore honor and decency to the presidency and to help bring the Watergate era to an end. But the road would not be an easy one. Ford began his term by pardoning Richard Nixon, a controversial act that probably cost him election to a full term in 1976. Ford presided over Vietnam's final chapter and agreed to evacuate thousands of people before the fall of Saigon. To make matters worse, late in 1974, the already struggling economy went into a severe recession. Unemployment rose to levels not seen since the Great Depression, and the Democratic Congress made fighting unemployment its top priority. But many of the bills introduced to accomplish this exceeded the tight budget President Ford had proposed to fight inflation. As a result, Ford vetoed the bills time and time again.